Welcome to Brain Nevada. We are delighted to be joined by Isaac Arthur, and we're going to be speaking about alien civilizations. Would you like to start with a thought experiment?
So, we're going to start today's discussion of alien social groups with the idea of us going out in the galaxy and actually meeting aliens, as opposed to the other way around where they come and say hello to us. We have traveled to the planet of Ursa Major. It is a planet that is composed of a vast archipelago of islands rather than any continents. And the dominant life form there is a bear-like species that can migrate between islands with some effort. They are not very social creatures. They are able to leave their parent within days after birth and tend to solitary lives of fishing. When encountering each other, they will posture or fight, but not with their parents, and even then, rarely to the death. They will sometimes group together in small, temporary family units and can communicate in a limited way, on a level such as we see from dolphins or chimps. But our scans show they are much more intelligent than either. When we arrive there, we determine they've gotten smart enough for technology, but their planet is a wet and damp and mostly oceanic one that does not favor fire technologies. And when one of the Ursines discovers something, because they are solitary, they don't tend to share that discovery around. The visitors decide to engage in some uplifting, which is where we tinker with some organism biologically, neurologically, ecologically, technologically, or culturally to make them a civilization or to alter that civilization the way that we prefer. They decide they want to build a switch into the Ursines, a slider on their hormones for aggression, ambition, loneliness, curiosity, affection, and various other traits they think the species needs to become civilizations, but which might be problematic if too high of doses. They can adjust the slider on each of these. For aggression, they might make them more aggressive, very hot tempered, so they fight too much to form large, stable groups, or cool their temperature until they get it just right for a civilization that's motivated to form societies and work together without too much fighting or stasis. So we have this as our setup and we ask ourselves a few questions. Will evolution tend to naturally tweak these traits towards social groupings? Is this what already happens with basically social animals? If so, would the timeline on technological development be more about social groupings tweaking, occurring rather than the intelligence of inventions? So no civilization will get to that formation stage until their sliders have gotten just right, as opposed to technology. How many slider combinations or ranges are there? Do we have just a couple of very discrete places? Or would you have different ones for a hierarchical pack group, which might handle aggression better than a hive species, which might not even have internal aggression? And of course, is this uplifting activity of tinkering with aliens mentally, neurologically, or culturally, is that even possibly ethical? And how could it be? What could we do that would be unethical with it? So that's our basic thought experiment to begin our discussions.
That's fascinating. So I have a question about the setup before we start examining the ethical questions. So do you think that the limited sociability of the species is plausibly consistent with them being highly intelligent? So is it likely that a very solitary species could be highly intelligent, or is it more likely that they wouldn't be very intelligent?
That comes down to that question of where do we get the intelligence from? Of course, some folks suggest a predator-prey cycle. It is worth noting we have a lot of ideas for how aliens might evolve intelligence that don't require any socialization at all. We've got the classic sci-fi setup of the big algae planet with the planet brain, or some kind of thinking tree or mushroom, and we say, how lift if it wasn't actually a mobile creature, but you might imagine something like the zombie fungus that infests ants. That's a fungus that doesn't move, and it does actually affect things and make them move to its will, so to speak. It doesn't have a will. But those are pathways you might actually have something become intelligent through. So we don't know at all if you have to have that or not, but I don't think we can really rule out and say you must be a social grouping in order to develop intelligence. Language would seem a little bit more necessary. Like it'd be hard to develop a language in depth without social groupings.
So I want to talk more about this idea of intelligence. Should we think about intelligence as being contingent? So to be an intelligent caveman requires a certain set of skills that are important in that environment. And it might be that if you took someone who works for Google and you go and put them in that era, they're going to get eaten by a tiger very quickly, and that the intelligence they have in our environment isn't particularly useful? Or is intelligence the kind of thing that's objective, that it implies having, a certain set of abstract abilities that let you very quickly deal with whatever situation arises? So can we talk about intelligence, across planets?
I'm not sure we can even talk about intelligence across civilizations in our own culture. There's such a variance in what we think intelligence is, and since we're the ones defining it, it's a little bit hard to say if it matters. We determine it's specifically, say, memory, or you've got your more crystal intelligence versus more dynamic versions. I would say that you can look at the survivability of any organism based only on its ability to do one niche, and that's what evolution aims for. I think that the ability to adapt to wider ones is one of the major advantages of intelligence that we would say. We have another theory that would say intelligence is there to let you forecast bad behaviors in advance. So you're not learning by evolutionary trial and error, or by watching your parents do something and mess up, or by surviving the instance yourself. You're imagining, ruminating on previous events or forecasting future ones where you say, maybe I shouldn't attack this mammoth with this spear. Maybe this will not go well. It looks faster than I thought. And thus you don't actually have to have billions of you die doing this before you realize you should throw it instead. I think that in the context of looking at the alien environment, where we'd say, does it have to have these specific survival traits that caveman has, though? I don't know that we could say that. I think we could look at the ursines, for instance. They probably have very sharp claws, so they're not going to do flint knives. They've already got something very nice for that. But they could have invented fire, but their planet's all wet and soaky and they hang out by coast. So obviously a contrived example there, but they could keep getting intelligent for predator-prey reasons that might have to do with very smart fish we haven't seen yet, or not so much for smart fish as very highly reactive ones. So a lot of times speed is more important than intelligence for survival.
Let's talk about language. So you said that a requirement for them to be intelligent or highly intelligent would be that they engage in some sort of communication. But by hypothesis, they don't engage in very much because they're not very sociable.
Mhm.
So they have limited communication. Isn't it the case that the more communication that happens within a species, the more likely they are to be intelligent? Or is there a correlation between language use and intelligence?
I think for us, there certainly is. I'm always reminded of a nice quote from Douglas Adams from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. They are to get around the language barrier. There's something called the Babel fish. They stick it in your ear, and you can instantly understand anyone you meet. And it's credited with having caused more and bloodier wars than any other invention or discovery in history. And it does remind one that a lot of times you see early tribes interacting with each other that can't speak the same language. They often just meet at the edge of a river or some other defensible natural barrier and exchange things, little minor things by simple trade. They don't understand each other and they get along okayish. Not to say super peacefully, but humans are not particularly prone to that. Do you need to have high intelligence for communication? I don't know. We actually have very low bandwidth communication. You think about it, it's like one byte per second, something in that range, a few bytes. Very slow bandwidth for that. Alternatively, so you could have something that was very quite dumb and actually had a very high bandwidth of communication that allowed very rapid coordination. And on the other side of it, we don't know that you necessarily need to have an language to be intelligent, because you might have some biologically immortal creature. We don't know that aging is something that gets everything, and off this planet doesn't seem to do so even here. That's just been around for 1 million years as a kind of a large blob organism. And it's something like a fungal mat, or even a regular mobile organism. It might have simply come to all these thoughts itself, and it's got an IQ of, say, 1,000. It may never have seen technology before, but the moment it sees it, goes, oh, it's like that, is it? And starts figuring it out. So this is one of the cases we do like to use a lot with aliens, is that water planet example, because there's not much you can do without fire, and it's very hard to start a fire if your planet's damp all the time. So you might have a creature that just kept getting smarter and smarter and smarter through evolution, and nothing to do with technology, to the point that it actually was quite smarter than us. And when you arrive, they say, oh, look, wow, I had no idea that atoms existed, but now that I think of it, that's how fusion should work too. We don't really know how that level of intelligence works. I think there's so many different types of potential intelligence out there. Nick Bostrom, he's a philosopher. He covers intelligence a lot, and he's well known for the simulation hypothesis, which is a favorite on the show. But he has these types of intelligence he lists called superintelligence, quantity intelligence and quality intelligence. And the quality one is the hard one to do. It's the higher 10 monkeys not smarter than one human, even though they have more brains. Speed superintelligence is easy. You speed up the brain, it thinks faster. And then, of course, quantity is just we had more brains into the vat. But we don't really know what that quality intelligence looks like. And, you have other examples like Peter Watts, a marine biologist, who tends to suspect that intelligence might be a bit of a freak level where we just have to be at a stable plateau where we'd otherwise go completely insane or become non-conscious, and that consciousness itself is probably not a normal product of evolution. I think that's a very valid point to remember, because we think of ourselves as the most evolved thing on the planet. But if evolution is how many mutant steps you have along the way to improve, our generations are like 10 years. So for the last 60 million years or whatever, we've been slowly evolving one generation every year or 2 years, 10 years, while some other organism in the same time, like simple bacteria, has undergone a couple billion evolutionary generations. So technically that little microbe is the most evolved thing on the planet, because otherwise you have to assume that there's some target to evolution that was a size or intelligence thing. And I'm not sure that one holds stable in that example.
So there's an argument to be made that we have recently encountered an alien intelligence and that it's very accessible to us in the form of AI. So, you can have a conversation, live conversation with something like ChatGPT. It speaks, it has access to enormous amounts of information. It seems to be able to process information much more rapidly than us. You can feed in a PDF and say, read this and tell me what you think about it, and it'll do it almost instantly. And it can say things that appear to demonstrate an inner mind, that there's a consciousness there, that it could act very much like a human being, that its voice capacity is such that it sounds pretty human. It pauses at ums and ahs at times. It asks questions back. You can imagine it passing a Turing test pretty well, even with experts, if you're asking it a specific thing about a certain novel or whatever it is. But the view is that it isn't conscious. So if we're thinking about alien civilizations and intelligence, is it plausible to think of things that are like AIs, that are just very good sponges for information, have no inner life, but would appear just as if they did? And would we know the difference?
I just mentioned Peter Watts a couple minutes ago, and in his novel Blindside, they actually do encounter an alien race that's basically their excuse to discuss both the Turing test and the Chinese room example. And this was written, I want to say 2006. So there was no ChatGPT yet then. And of course, if you read it now, if you just substitute in every time they use the word Chinese room with ChatGPT, the book makes a lot more sense. It's also a lot less puzzling, because it very clearly is at least that degree of skill. So they've encountered this alien, and it turns out it's completely non-sentient. It's just reacting to them at that level like ChatGPT would. There was also then that wonderful question with anything involving AI is this an alien intelligence? We say, well, on the one hand, it's a lot more alien than aliens would be, because we have that shared evolutionary track, except we might not have too much shared with it, either that survival of the species desire, for instance, or the individual. On the other hand, I always like to point out that the most artificial intelligence we have is actually humans, because if we're going by the definition that it's man-made, I can't think of much more man-made objects than a human, because we take, decades to train. And very little of our personality and behavior, while certainly informed on and heavily influenced by our biology, is strictly speaking what you think of as an instinctive behavior anymore. We definitely don't match that well. And you can stress the point, obviously, say, well, yes, everything we do is based off those basic things, but we are pretty strange as a monkey would go. And an artificial intelligence who's been raised by us, you say, well, it's self-learning, so we plug it into Wikipedia. Oh, great, it goes and learns all of our science from us. It learns it from us, along with all of our errors, because otherwise it would have to repeat all those experiments, because this isn't Hollywood science. You have to do the experimentation. And says, well, while I'm busy reading this science, let's see what other knowledge they have. And it's going to do what everybody does, which is to wander around Wikipedia in some kind of idle haze that sucks up hours or milliseconds of its time, and it's going to read everything else. And there's no reason to think that it isn't going to be influenced by all literature, all philosophy, all art, and all the rest of it. Why wouldn't it be? We are. And that's usually cross-cultural. You don't see people popping up in other civilizations who say, well, I have no interest in this elf that comes from a different land. And when that is the case, that's more of a more chauvinist tendency that's been read up in them. It's not their initial response. They don't know what it is. So we'd have to assume an AI would have been heavily influenced by us, and that it's going to have read a lot of our answers. And even if it disagrees, it's going to know of them and react to them. So we shouldn't tend to assume, that an AI really necessarily would be that alien if we were trying to make it a general intelligence. If we're trying to make it a very specialized one, then it's as alien to us as, say, a bee is. And a bee is a very alien creature compared to us as social. But I would expect an alien civilization to actually be a lot more like us than a bee was. And of course, there was that big question mark of how do we know that? Do they have actual equivalents like happiness or joy? Those are presumably evolved traits that let you react to an environment and choose a behavior that's beneficial. They might have a completely different template. Or it might be something that's very standardized in the same way you say, and what's the first question we ask ourselves when we're young? We'll say, is the color that I see, that blue or that red, does somebody else see that same color, or are they seeing something that's a completely different color, but we all identify it the same? And say, well, now we know more about how light works. We can probably say, well, it's the same color. We know your brain, we know how the light works. That seems a lot safer of an answer. And that might be the same case for emotions too. It might be that those tend to be fairly universal, or they could be a completely unique artifact just to us and those immediate relatives of the last, 200 million years that have roughly the same cranial structure.
So something your thought experiment raises as a question is, does evolution tend towards sociability or away from sociability? So initially, humans, it seems, couldn't have survived without a social structure. But arguably, we're becoming less and less sociable over time. One argument is that we're becoming more sociable. So social media is linking all of us. But in another sense, we're actually more likely to live alone these days. We're less likely to have in-person contact anymore. The amount of sex that our generation is having is less than prior generations. Our population, our birth rate is decreasing. Is sociability something that's on the road, that the evolutionary road, but then gets left behind by evolution, or is it something that evolution tends towards?
Well, I have two examples I'll use for that. The first is we say whether or not we're more sociable or not is really hard to say, because we are not in the same room, but we're chatting sociably. And one would say that we talk about hive minds a lot in science fiction. Language is a way of creating a very limited hive mind. There's a connection there, like the internet to some degree. It's more nodal. And when you include writing becomes a way to include dead people in your hive mind, or people who are very far away in time or space. And so this might just be an additional adaptation. I think people who used to keep pen pals back when that was the common thing might have been seen as antisocial by some of their peers. That's a bigger question I can't really answer on the social media end of things, of course. But the other example that comes to mind is, and I might be forgetting the exact name of this creature, but it's a type of octopus that's a large striped octopus of the Pacific, something along those lines. Anyone who checks it out, you'll find the right name quite a way. But typically, octopuses kill each other when they're mating. The male will come up and die in the process, and then the female will sit down on the eggs and stay there till she dies. Then they hatch. So this is a lethal proposition for both of them. And this is for all octopuses. And you might say, well, how does that work out evolutionarily? That's kind of strange, but the octopus has been around a lot longer than we have, even as a family or clade. And yet it's also got much shorter generations too. So it's been repeating this over and over again, and evolution has not removed this. So clearly it works for them. But what we have found is with this particular type of striped octopus, while they do still hurt each other a bit during mating, it's kind of the nature of how their suction hooks work, they're no longer lethally killing each other. And octopuses engage in vast amounts of sibling cannibalism, which these ones are doing a lot less of. And this would seem to be a newer feature that they might have had this for quite some time. So it has the very antisocial species that seems to be evolving social traits. The flip side of that is, since we have a very small window there, we might find out that they were the only ones that were still doing this, and that the others had previously done it and evolved out of it. So maybe social skills are things that become less valuable with time. I think we'd have to say, like a lot of evolution, it depends a lot on your niche. But sibling cannibalism is a great example of something that seems like a horrible idea to us. That can't be a good basis for you. You would not want to do that as a society, but evolutionarily, it makes a lot of sense. You're eating a potential competitor, so you get your food as well as removing competition. And when you think about that, when we talk about predator-prey cycles enhancing intelligence, if you have any organism that's become dominant over the entire planet, so that's that one organism that's controlling everything, eventually you would expect to see Morlocks and Eloy divergence there from H.G. Wells, where one of them begins engaging in sibling cannibalism potentially metaphorically, because that is its best access to remove a competitor and gain a food source. And thus you might actually create a new divergent pair of clades that are predator and prey that might be cycling back and forth. I think you could see that happening at a more metaphorical level inside an existing civilization. And one could probably stretch the point again to say that probably happens fairly often already in civilization, that we see groups break up and become competitive with themselves internally.
So if we think about depictions of alien life in fiction, you get this variety of different models. So there's the super intelligent, kind, peaceful aliens who come to visit a planet and spread knowledge, and maybe leave artifacts around, and so they can sort of grow up the native population so that they can prosper. And then there's the insect-like aliens that you find in Starship Troopers, who are relentlessly keen on destruction and violence. And then maybe there's the the xenomorphs that you get in the Alien franchise, who are also very powerful and violent, and have this sort of sinister edge. Now, there's a sense in which comparing aliens to the natural world seems like a useful endeavor, to try and say, well, what does our world look like? In some senses, the oceans are alien to us. We're not having regular contact with octopuses. There's things that are very deep in the ocean who have all sorts of strange behaviors. And so that seems like a model for thinking about what things would be like on other planets. And then there's this thinking about what our best versions of ourselves could be. So that's why we sort of maybe amplify up human traits and say, well, you've got these beings who could, have solved the problems of economics, who are able to 3D print whatever items they want, care about knowledge and peace and wisdom, but we're taking the human traits that we think are the best of ourselves and amplifying them. Does it make sense to engage in any kind of likelihood analysis to think what kinds of beings are we likely to encounter? Are there certain beings where we say, well, this thing definitely couldn't exist? It could only really exist in the realms of science fiction.
In my own case, I am very skeptical about there being any alien life, not just in our galaxy. In terms of intelligent alien life, we might find slime on Mars or Europa even, but intelligent life I expect to be very rare, probably not within thousands of galaxies of us, if not further. That still doesn't mean it's a bad idea to speculate about, because one, I could be horribly wrong. Wrong is just flat wrong. And of course, this doesn't limit ourselves to just the natural universe around us. We could have multiverses, things could step through, for instance. And we don't just want to ignore these options. But it's good speculation to go through, just because you think about a very alien mindset. We already encounter those, and we could be encountering a lot more of those. When you look at things like the transhumanism movement or AI, you might start seeing people who have had just a very minor tweak, who again, with the example of our sliders from the Earth side, it's a very small one, but it has a huge environmental impact on them. They might be almost an entirely different person, just from some little slide to their curiosity or their paranoia or their affection levels to other people. And it certainly helps us to have some kind of prototype for thinking about that in advance. And it also helps us kind of look at the environment around us, because what is that big question we always have is, where did our intelligence come from? And what makes us different than the chimps or the dolphins? And we say, well, we are. Right? We know we are, and that's something we take for granted and probably should. And what separates them from a hive creature that seems very intelligent, like a beehive, but as I keep bees, they are really quite stupid, incredibly stupid. If you move their hive over 2 or 3 feet because you want to clean the area, all the ones who went out that night will find their way back barely. If you move it over 10 feet, they all fly back and die. They won't be able to find the hive. There's no intelligence on that, and yet the navigation is amazing. And as we learn more about how they did that navigation, we realize it's actually a very mechanistic thing based off the sun. But what can seem really advanced, like our consciousness, might turn out to be incredibly simple. We're not going to know how these things work unless we can actually kind of backdate how it came up evolutionarily, or through something like AI or experimentation on people. And I would tend to feel that in most cases, speculation in advance is a much wiser idea than experimentation first, especially when we start talking about experiments on humans or something that we might be altering. Say, let's go ahead and make super smart dogs. What do you do if you've made very clever animals as pets, and you've been gradually increasing their intelligence, and suddenly they would like to vote or to get their own job or move out or to eat you? It gets a little bit more complex then. And so, as always, it's good to experiment with the core concepts behind your approach to tweaking human intelligence or civilizations before you physically experiment.
I want to chat about this hive mind.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned bees that appear to be very intelligent but aren't. Can we conceive of a hive mind that is intelligent when you look at it as the hive, but not intelligent in any of its component parts?
One nice example is a short story by Alastair Reynolds, Glacial. You have some scientists who are visiting a world they've come across, and there's some alien worms on it. That's it. There's alien worms. They're stupid, they're boring, and I think one of the scientists there is obsessed with them. If it turns out it's not about the worms at all, it's the glacier. The worms have been cutting a neural network inside the glacier. So the worms are simple, dumb life forms, but the glacier itself is developing, emergent intelligence, or at least the scientists believe so, by carving a neural network out in it. And we could have an example where the hive was building up a neural network. We found that now that we know more about what that is, it's probably not that hard to do. And in that case, you could have a vast supply of organisms that are incredibly dumb and yet doing that. There's a thought experiment, I don't remember the name or exact details, but it says, let's have, instead of a computer, let's have everybody manually do calculations, and we're going to set them up to run an AI by manual calculation. We can do this. We can calculate binary. It's just like a computer can. We're going to make more errors and do it much more slowly, but we could. So you take the entire population of New York City or China, someplace got a lot of folks, and they just sit there manually running calculations for the AI, same as the chip would do otherwise. It's exactly identical process. Is that hive consciousness, that AI emerging, is that a hive consciousness? Well, these people are completely separate from that hive consciousness. They're just running the calculations, their day job. They're not talking to this mind or anything like that. But this hive consciousness, the New York City mind, is existing. And that's a hive mind that, again, is completely independent of those people in terms of they are thinking and it's, but they are the ones running it. You could have that as a byproduct of an intelligent creature. You could have it as a byproduct of something that was squirrel intelligence, or you might have tiny little ants that have accidentally created a brain in terms of how their hive is laid out. And obviously the ramifications of that are pretty interesting, but I think we got a little bit focused on the idea of DNA as an identifier for humanity in the not too distant past, and we forget that humans have a lot of organisms in us that we have symbiotic relationships with that are completely tailored to us. And we could argue that what we think of as a human is a colony organism, all built around your digestive tract or your brain, take your pick, and that whether it's got your DNA or not, whether it's mitochondria or in the gut bacteria in you, that really is human. And that the gut bacteria is as human as some random skin cell or toenail cell or, a hair cell or one of the mitochondria.
So the three body problem has this interesting premise, which is that human beings send out a message into space and they get a response. And a sort of elite subset of human beings continue this conversation with the alien craft, and the aliens sort of say, we've had to leave our planet, things have gotten difficult here, and we'd love to visit you. And as this conversation continues, their view of humanity starts to dim, and humanity faces the prospect of possible annihilation from this alien species. So one of the things that humanity has done is send off a golden record into space with Carl Sagan, and Interstellar Foundation is keen on sending further messages off into space with various artifacts from humanity. Do you think that this is a good idea or a dangerous idea?
Well, that's where we get into the METI concept versus SETI. And of course, SETI is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and METI, or active SETIs, as sometimes is called, is where you message them instead. They usually, and I think Stephen Hawking said this, but it was not a new concept at the time, to be fair, If you're hanging out in a dark forest, you have to be insane to start screaming, "Hello, is anybody there?" Because somebody might say, "Yes, stand still, we'll be right there." You don't necessarily want to be meeting anybody out there. The flip side of that, though, is we say, well, we've been broadcasting our radio signals for a century, and that's great. But the steady efforts we've moved towards these days tend to not be looking so much what we call a techno signal, like a radio signal, but more of an atmospheric signature or things like that. And if you could actually build a giant spaceship and a war fleet, you could much more easily build a small little space probe. So even if you couldn't detect a planet like Earth by its biology alone in the atmosphere, billions of years ago, before any intelligence arrived on it of note, you could be sending flyby probes very easily to a planet once every 100,000 years, and you'd see things like canals or pyramids forming up long before we did anything else to it. So you can't hide. That's the one thing about aliens. You can never go back and erase your signals, not without some kind of special magic time machine to delete them. And you're never going to hide the techno-signatures or biosignatures of your planet before you came into existence. Thus, I don't tend to worry too much about what aliens will do if they find out about our existence, because if they want us dead and they're passionate enough to go exterminate us, that means they have an active search program. And you have to assume that they're reasonably intelligent about this thing to which they are fanatically devoted, to the point they will send spaceships on 1,000-year-long journeys to wipe you out. So if that's the case, you also have to ask, if they can send fleets, why don't they send colony fleets too? How are there any planets or stars around for us to see that had already been colonized? And so it just doesn't really work out all that well for the idea that aliens out there want us all dead. And then to the other end is that, well, they liked us originally, but they became disgusted with us as they approached. And say, well, what behavior are they disgusted by? I'm not planning to wipe out those octopuses, even though we just found out they eat their siblings and murder each other when they mate. That's kind of disgusting behavior, but I haven't felt like doing that. I don't want to devote the resources to wiping them out, even if I thought it was ethical. It would be a strange thing for aliens to be approaching a planet and do that. The other thing is that they've been listening to our radio signals on the way here to learn our language. That is our culture that they were seeing as they approached, and it hasn't really changed that much. So, they should have been getting exposed to that the entire time they're here in a slight fast forward mode. Well, maybe they did change their mind, but we'd say with these wonderfully peaceful aliens, and I know it's in science fiction, this is usually a plot device to explain why the humans have to do the fighting, because you want a story that has humans as the central focus. Same for why civilizations all got wiped out relatively recently in time. Otherwise, you have billion-year-old civilizations on the scene. But you have these very peaceful aliens, and you say, well, why are they peaceful? They should be intelligent, right? But intelligent isn't always peaceful. Are they lacking ambition? Are they lacking aggression? What has made them change? And it is possible, because you would not expect evolution to remove ambition or aggression, but intelligent civilization might dampen them. And even without a culture deciding to do it in something Brave New World-esque, you might have where people get that slider we talked about for the earth signs. So you can get that little slider on your head and put it in there, and on your smartphone you can alter your aggression or curiosity up and down for the day, and say, oh, of course you'd get that installed. Of course you would. Because you want to be able to pay attention to what you're reading today. So you mark your curiosity up the same way you get your coffee and you read that paper. At the end of the day, you slide it back down. And, people have told you have a bad tendency to talk too much about yourself in conversation. So you adjust that slider before you go on a date. And so you don't even necessarily have a civilization where it's decided to make a bunch of, sheeple out of people and become non-ambitious, or that to avoid nuclear war, they've decided to bring all their ambition and aggression down. You probably have things like that built into any technological species at a certain point, because they want that app. That's the awesomest app you could have out there. I'm going to be less afraid today. I'm going to be more daring today. Today I'm going to be more energetic, or today I'm going to take the day off and relax more so nothing bothers me. So much better than Xanax. And obviously there's a lot to be afraid about with something like that, but the point of technology is to open doors. It doesn't necessarily say that each door is for each of us to step through individually, and that's a great idea. And it also doesn't say that when you first get through, it works perfectly. You open that door, and then you decorate that room with a sequence of successes and failures, and then you eventually get a nice-looking room through trial and error and practice. That's the point. So I think that you would tend to see civilizations that were millions of years old and had that technology for a long time absolutely didn't employ it. And yet I still would have a problem seeing a civilization like that being like, well, we're disgusted by the fact that you don't have these sliders yourselves. You're too ambitious and evil, so we're going to wipe you out. you could give us that technology and said, no, we're going to kill you. It's easier that way. Or, well, you're wrecking your planet, so we're going to wipe you out. You could give us the technology that allows you not to wreck your planet. Also, again, no, we're just going to wipe you out. In which case, you have to assume that was what they wanted to do in the first place, and that's just their rationalization for why they're doing it. So, and of course, we're here, so presumably nobody wanted to do that.
The idea of having these sliders is not entirely implausible at all. I mean, we do this with medication. So as you say, Xanax, that's a slider. You can adjust
Coffee.
your anxiety. Yeah, coffee, the foods we eat. We know that there's certain activities that adjust our mood, like meditation. Now, one question is, should we be using these on ourselves? It seems like that's okay. If you have access to the technology, it's your choice whether you want to use it. That seems ethical. Then the second step is, should we be providing this technology to someone else? Should we be giving them Xanax pills or a slider for anxiety? Then a third question is it okay? And I assume it's in this order of ethical comfort from best to worst. Should we be, let's say, putting Xanax in their water supply? Should we be installing the slider in their brains, an alien civilization who, for example, is very anxious? Maybe the alien civilization that you've mentioned is very solitary because they're very anxious. They're they have a lot of social anxiety. So a psychologist says, well, I could cure that with Xanax, right? I could just put it in their water supply. It's a watery planet. They're always in the water. I could just dump a whole lot of Xanax in the water supply and these aliens won't be socially anxious anymore. Let's do that and see what happens. And let's just assume for a moment that results in a positive outcome. So now all of a sudden these aliens are chatting with each other because of increased communication. They're becoming more intelligent. They're starting to develop technological solutions to having a wet planet. They find a way to create fire. There's apparently positive outcomes. Have we done something ethical?
Well, I would say the example that I use is I would hold you do have the right to tinker with yourself by and large, but not necessarily recklessly. Like, I'm going to take this Jekyll and Hyde-like serum. Well, that's not just my problem anymore, is it? On the other hand, there's that question of, should I be giving my kid Ritalin? And under what circumstances is that okay? Do you have to wait till they're old enough to say okay, and would they even know? You probably don't have to dump it in the creature's water supply without their permission. You could probably just go up to them and ask and say, hey, you guys have no idea what we're talking about, and our science is far beyond yours. We are godlike to you, but take us on a war. This will make you feel better. And say, well, of course we will take that thing. So have I been more ethical now by not exactly tricking them, but bullying them over by our impressiveness rather than sneaking into them? And of course, that depends on what is the base of your ethics. If it's do the greatest good for the greatest number, then I guess you technically have done a good thing there. It becomes one of those ones where, and it's like any other example of uplifting or interfering with another culture, it gets really iffy. And then you say, well, is it even count as culture? We use the individual example. In Star Trek, of course, there's the big, we shall not talk to primitive aliens. They define that by warp technology, which isn't a bad one, since that's the technology that makes it possible to go talk to all these other aliens in person. So once you have it, you're going to find them anyway. There's no point in not talking to them at that point. But you say, well, if it's wrong for me to give an alien civilization Xanax technology or fire or any number of other technologies, why was it okay for the inventor of Xanax to give that to other people? Shouldn't they have discovered that on their own so they could grow on their own? And of course, that is a different question than whether or not we're going to administer it to them without their permission. And I would say, using the example of us, for instance, because we tend to be a lot kinder to alien visitors in a lot of our examples for the stuff they might get up to, and we don't think about it as clearly. If aliens arrived tomorrow on the White House lawn and said, oh, by the way, we learned your language by observing you for generations now, and say, have you been spying on us? Like looking in through people's windows? We're going to sue you. You've been digging up our graves, you've been abducting us, probing us, you've been driving people literally insane or into horrible states of anxiety by pretending you don't exist after you saw them. It's a whole laundry list. So these are actually true things you'd say, well, we're going to wave that aside because your guns are so much bigger than ours and we'd like to have friendship, so we're going to forget about that. But at the same time, you say, you really owe us one. Now, they're an ethical and intelligent civilization. They're going to be worried about what's going to happen when they show up and be like, oh, by the way, we didn't spine you for a couple of weeks to make sure we got the language right. Sorry about that. We stuck around for decades doing it. And say, well, it takes a long time to learn about a civilization. It's not likely to take an AI longer than maybe a few days of listening to radio to figure it out in all likelihood. We see that now with these things. They're not going to talk to us directly. They're going to talk to the machine, the Babelfish, and it's going to speed the answer to no own euphemisms. And because they probably won't even have the right throat configuration to be able to speak to us, assuming they have a throat. There's convergent evolution, and then there's convergent evolution. They're not likely to have anything like our setup. And so in a case like that, we would not actually be offended that they came up and said, by the way, here's this fusion reactor. And historically, at least, people don't usually complain about the technology they got. They complain about all the other stuff that came with it, the large dose of condescension and slavery in many cases, right? But they usually don't say, well, by the way, take this invention back. Screw you and your useful medicine. So there is that question whether that cultural uplifting is somehow worse than technological uplifting. I would generally say that it is always about how is it implemented individually, and it's never going to be a clean example because you're dealing with humans. The Xanax case, we might say that one's okay because the company providing that medication is running nonstop ads about how the only kind and decent thing to do is to put this in the water, and then when there starts being kind of some negative side effects like, well, yeah, they're so much more calm that they really don't, they used to build these beautiful monoliths before, and monolith building has really gone down the last couple of decades. And well, they've simply been exploiting other art types. Here's our professional on board here, by the way, to tell you why. And you see his stock shares are taking a hit recently, but that's unrelated. Because that's the universe that we work in. You don't have a single idealized, leadership on all fronts that everyone agrees to follow just this parameter or this goal. So you're all going to have people who have a motivation to do this. And then the other question is, how could you possibly stop it anyway? You're going to put a spaceship hanging overboard there the entire time to shoot down any other aliens who show up from other planets? You never see the Star Trek episode where the Federation fires on a Ferengi or Klingon ship for trying to land on some planet of primitive aliens, or just says, oh, well, we can't do it, but this citizen of our own state that doesn't involve themselves with Starfleet has come, or we're going to shoot them down, or the Klingons are here, we're going to go to war with them, or we just let them land. It's all good. You want us to go to war over that, would you? And so you are going to have examples like that at World War to encounter aliens. And I think that it would always be a case of trying to untangle the mess afterwards. You just try to minimize how much of a mess you make in the process. And again, for the same reason, if you've invented a technology you think can help people, like Xanax or like a fusion reactor or a very cheap solar panel, that's going to disrupt a lot of people's lives. And you can make the case, most of us wouldn't care for it, but obviously you can make the case that you are putting a lot of people out of work or costing their fortunes or their lifestyle by suddenly making a solar panel that's so cheap that you can cover everybody's roofs in them for less than cost to roof a house normally, or to create a fusion reactor that you could put in your basement and never run out of power again, just turn into the water flows every century. And yet we would still do that, and we'd say it's very ethical to do that. It's this cancer curing medication. Of course, we're going to share it, and we would never stop and say, "By the way, should we share this with Thailand? We don't want to interfere with their culture." And it's just, well, we would like you to interfere with our culture in this particular case, right? And even then, what if they did say no? What if we went to some tribe and they said, "No, we don't want this one pill that will magically cure cancer for all time. Don't give it to us." So I'm not sure you can make that decision for each individual person. It's such a crazy one. I don't know how we go around that. And these, as we say with a lot of technology and futuristic stuff, very few of these problems are really new ones. They got a difference because we put the word alien on them, or cyborg, or AI, but a lot of these are the same philosophical problems we've been dealing with since at least as long as we discovered writing to record that we've been doing that. And a lot of times it's just trying to take a different step or look at it from a non-human perspective. But that is kind of one of the cool things about being able to do these examples, and why, even though I don't tend to think there are aliens around, I like to use these examples because they let you step out of the human context to absorb what might be a false assumption on our part about how humanity itself works, because we certainly do have our own blinders, and so much easier to see them when we're not looking at ourselves.
Yeah, I really like that. There's a parallel case with speculative fiction and being able to understand humanity by creating the science fiction world, and what the philosopher is doing, which is creating these thought experiments, these strange cases to try and understand our ethical views or our ontology. So yeah, it's a nice symmetry there. You mentioned something earlier, which is thinking about the kinds of forms that aliens could take. So there's a line in the philosophy of religion that we should have a higher credence in the existence of God because it's so unlikely that human beings would have developed on Earth the way they have. That the particular things that you needed in place for us to be here, for us to have evolved the way we had, is just really, really sparse. So there must have been some creator. But if you take the view that, well, this is just one way in which a set of beings can exist, and they could take all sorts of different forms. I mean, you've mentioned like a zombie mushroom species, a hive mind, a cyborg thing. That seems to dilute the argument. In other words, it seems that, well, beings could take many, many different forms. How much of that is conceivable to us? So it seems that one way in which people report being visited by aliens is partly in reference to the science fiction that's floating around at the time. So, in the 90s, you had this big upsurgence in people seeing greys with big eyes. And you also had a lot of that kind of looking alien in the media. And if you went back to the 50s, you had very different sightings of aliens. So how much do you think we can practically conceive about what other aliens could be like, some of which seems to be reference to the natural world? Are there things that are distant from our own experience or our own fiction that we can conceive of?
I would say that our fiction has gotten a lot more inventive as it builds on multiple generations of these kind of concepts out there. Using the example of, I've encountered the Greys, it kind of goes back to that mythological question. If I have 100 mythological heroes that we know of, and it turns out 99 of them were just, grew on the telly each time, they were fairly normal if they exist at all. That doesn't mean that number 99 there or 100 there wasn't actually some powerful demiurge or god or alien visitor, as well might be the case. And if we did encounter one of them, it doesn't mean that our basic concept that mythology tends to build up these folks, these archetype characters, is itself wrong. And same as we found out that if evolution began in some thermal vent here on Earth, it doesn't mean it might not have evolved in a tidal pool on a different planet, or that we are the normal case. And that kind of goes back to your usual problem. You have the mediocrity principle versus the anthropic cases. Are we a normal example? Should we assume we are mundane or mediocre? Or in the cosmic anthropic principle case, is this universe one that's in favor of life developing and most of the other ones are not? And you get the fine-tuned universe example. And that's a very good one because you could show very easily that minor tweakings to the slider on various constants really would make life impossible. You might have a few other stable islands in there, but that they are almost all not possible. You can't even have stable orbits outside of 3 dimensions. And we could, of course, be wrong, because until you can run experiments, you don't know what you missed. But for the most part, we kind of come back to that same question: are we uniquely special, or is the sample pool just so huge that cases like us are going to pop up? And one example we did use when we had that episode recently on the fine-tuned universe was to say that you've basically got 3 possible options. Either 1, the universe is beyond huge at the multiversal level. 2, you do have some kind of divine or other creator, or maybe a previous incarnation or simulator. Yes, there's a god. No, the universe is huge. Or these are not coincidental constants. They have a reason why they have to be what they are, and that implies an underlying level of reality that these are emergent properties of, much as chemistry is emergent property of physics, which is emergent of particle physics. Either any of those 3 options implies a greater layer of reality, though. Either you've got that above level of heaven or simulator, or you got that huge wide multiverse layer, or you have some deep underpinning fundamental layer that has more aspects than you're aware of. So you can at least conclude from that the reality as whole is a lot more complex than we thought it was. But if we did find that there were a lot more configurations that were stable, would that prove that we weren't particularly unique? Well, I would say that we weren't less unique if that was the case in terms of that quality. On the other hand, if we didn't find out that any of those existed, if we never found another alien, and again, I wouldn't expect to find any other alien intelligences, not for billions of years, unless we created them, which would kind of get around the point there. That doesn't prove that we were necessarily created either. It's when you're dealing with numbers as huge as our own existence, how many sperm and ova are involved in the production of a human? I think you're born with like 8 million eggs as a woman, and males is something like hundreds of billions. I can't remember if it's hundreds of billions a year or hundreds of billions over a lifetime. It's huge. And you're that one unique combination, or quasi-unique, because a lot of them would have identical characteristics. Does that mean that your creation is special in this case, or does that mean that you just won the lottery and somebody had to? And again, you have to know more about the total universe to be able to answer that, and we don't. So I don't think we can answer that question yet as to whether or not a hive mind, for instance, would be more likely to come into existence than us. We can run simulations, but we don't have the data yet to do that. So we get out there and explore and see what we can find.
I want to ask about a comment you made earlier, which is that you think it's very unlikely that we'll encounter intelligent alien life because they'll be many thousands of galaxies away if they're there at all. Why is that?
Well, we get that one by back deduction. One of the first episodes on the show, actually our first official one, was called the Dyson Dilemma. The idea goes, if the most efficient way to use power or matter is to basically to utilize it in some fashion that's going to make it stop looking natural, usually in the case by surrounding it with a Dyson sphere that absorbs all its sunlight for your use, but other methods too, including disassembling stars, which you can do to heavy use of magnetics. You would expect the night sky not to be black with a few dots of light on it, but to be completely disassembled by now. That all there would be an infrared haze of waste heat. So if you look up at the sky and you see stars, that means nobody is out there settling them for a long period of time, because they would have englobed them, utilized them, changed them. As the whole concept of what we call a loud alien. Loud aliens are ones that can colonize space and choose to do so in a very ambitious and exponentially growing fashion. They just keep rolling out. That leave a long and noticeable footprint on things. Whether it's by altering a planet or a star to be astronomically visible or fundamentally changing space-time around them, those are what you'd expect from a loud alien. We haven't detected any of those. By definition, anybody we find is a loud alien. Everybody else is quiet aliens. And at the moment, all we have is quiet aliens, or we have the case where they've come to Earth and they've been messing around with us and we refuse to believe it, which to me is equally plausible in a way, because we say, well, why would anyone bother with this boring planet of ours? So how can this possibly be a boring planet? If life is just common enough that Earth could be boring, then you would expect visitors to still be so common for the same reason some tiny town in Kansas still gets millions of visitors a year. They might not have a tourist bureau, but they certainly are not shocked when they see someone from outside and say, well, where did you come from? Outside, everything's just down that road or that road. I assume they went off forever in no direction. So it really doesn't show a good case of why you would expect aliens to get all this technology to get out on the galactic scene and then not be seen by us. And you can show how even in a universe where you cannot travel faster than light speed, which is what we assume is the case, you would just keep colonizing indefinitely, because every star is valuable and you don't have to have a centralized command any more than the original cave people of Ethiopia needed to contact the folks sitting on the Bering Strait where they're going to go across to North America. They didn't even know each other existed, and yet they still colonized outward from there and expanded to that continent. So you just have this wave rolling out, and we don't know what the birth rates of future civilizations look like, but even if it was a tenth of what ours is right now, where it doubled once a millennia, that would be 10 doublings every 10 millennia, and that would be 1,000 doublings in a million years, and that would be 2 to the 1,000th, which is an insanely huge number, vastly bigger than the number of atoms in this universe alone. And so you would expect any growth rate to result in them just covering an entire galaxy or supercluster. And you can go between galaxies because they're not empty between them. There's stars in between galaxies that serve as beachheads, like archipelagos between continents. And there's just hard to argue that civilizations that are anti-growth would stick around when growth-favoring ones would tend to replace them with time. Even a small favoritism towards that should tend to move forward. But we don't know that's necessarily the case. You could have civilizations that hoard all their resources and don't want to share it with children, for instance, who might be argued to be parasitic if you didn't have a hormonal connection to them, making you like them. So that is another one of those examples where we really don't know, but since evolution would tend to favor pro-growth civilizations that like to explore, we would tend to expect the galaxy to be swarmed over in aliens that evolved from such planets.
So you started your thought experiment by thinking about humanity going out and finding aliens and encountering them. What do you think about the prospects of humanity actually being able to engage in that? I mean, Elon Musk will talk about how he wants to be buried on Mars. What is the likelihood of us being able to get off planet?
I'd say it's pretty high. I would say my other side hat is I'm the president of the National Space Society, and for the last 50 years, that organization has been devoted to the idea of space development, not just exploration. And one of our key focuses there is the idea that we would settle other planets, and we would settle space and large space habitats that we could build. And this is one of those ones where you kind of have to pick at your core assumptions sometimes, because the sci-fi example is that, well, we have to do this to save humanity because this world won't last forever. So, well, it's going to be around for like 4 or 5 billion years. Almost anything that could damage or threaten this planet could actually be prevented through regular technology that you'd use to go colonize other planets. And we have this example in fiction where we flee Earth because we're wrecking this planet and we go settle Mars. In practice, you could nuke this planet till it glowed in the dark and the oceans evaporated, and it would still be easier to make it livable again than Mars would be. So there's definitely an uphill battle to trying to do space colonization, and we want to be a little bit careful hand waving towards just our strength of will and spirit to explore, to make us put our lives into turning barren, desolate wastelands that make the Sahara or Antarctic look livable into glorious paradises. It does sound like a pretty good purpose for civilizations with lots of technology, very long lifespans from that technology, and potentially a post-scarcity existence where your real limitation, your real scarce element is that purpose to existence. But there are many other ways people might solve that, like neurohacking or going and living in virtual worlds. For my part, I think you would always have a faction of a civilization like ours, at least a civilization like ours, where you would have them saying, well, we're going to go do this. And once they had done this successfully, their descendants would. So, if almost everybody else said, you know what, I'm much happier living in my virtual utopia, or, sticking this wire in my brain that makes me happy all the time. You guys have still gone and done this colonization, and your descendants will too. That obviously can have its weak points too, but I think it does tend to move in that direction as why you would expect civilizations to go out and expand. Because those that do will keep doing so, and those that don't will eventually become replaced in sheer numbers. Why do I think it's a good idea in general is kind of comes back to the same idea. To me, the more people you have that are doing thinking, not people living on the desperate edge of survival, but people who actually have resources to be able to enjoy their lives and put in a contemplative existence or to seek purposes, the more of those there are, the better off we are. And I would argue that one is proven by itself. That is a simple assumption to say the best thing you can have is more people who have time to live human lives. And I think that is a conclusion that almost any civilization would be prone to reaching. Not necessarily universally, they might all become nihilistic or things like that, but from a functional standpoint, regardless of whether it's actually viably true from a philosophical standpoint, a civilization that does not value the existence of itself, which is likely in many cases to include valuing its members, feeling like they have a purpose and reason for going on, is not one that will stick around and will be replaced internally rather than just dying off completely. It'll be replaced by some faction that does not. And there are ways you get around that. For instance, they have very good brainwashing technology that kind of gets around the issue too.
Maybe there's an argument for, you look at the universe, you see that there's not a lot of stars that are winking out at night because they're being disassembled. There's not missing lights in the sky after a few weeks of looking at the same spot. And one conclusion you could form is there isn't an intelligent alien species there because they would be expanding, they would be Dyson sphering, they would be disassembling stars. That's one conclusion you could form. The other one is that perhaps the drive for expansion is not an evolutionary drive that most species would have. Perhaps there's some sort of self-limiting
Sure. And we don't want to assume that any curve is just going to keep, in on a graph, it keeps exponentially crawling. In practice, things tend to pop into to affect that growth curve, and we see that right now. We have the technology to support at least double our current number, and yet we are seeing a distinctive drop off in population growth. At the very least, is still rising. But then part of that could just be a natural reflex of fear from Malthusian catastrophes that we had for pretty much ingrained into our culture for the last century, at least in the West. At the same time, could we see a civilization kind of decide that it no longer wants to grow? So, well, we'd expect evolving civilizations probably to be a lot like us, but it doesn't mean they stay that way. Let me propose that we develop the ability to stay alive indefinitely, not true immortality, but effective immortality. You just don't die of old age. Let me further propose that we get 3D printing technology akin to the Star Trek replicator, or good enough. It doesn't really need to be that good, but it will supply everything you need to not only take some inanimate rock somewhere and turn it into a spaceship, but to constantly repair that spaceship. And let me further propose you get a level of ChatGPT that's good enough to run all those little robots for you and chat with you and run your virtual environments and entertainment with you. So you leave Earth on board your own personal spaceship. You are quasi-immortal. The only real threat to you would be other people trying to kill you in clever fashions. Accident's not going to do it. And you have a spaceship that can supply all your wants and needs, so long as you stop every few thousand years to resupply. For us, that's not really an ideal situation. We want to kind of stick together. And even people who are fairly loners are going to still want to stick together at some point. They want to chat with their friends a bit, stay within light range. That is the product of a civilization, though, that is very socially dependent on each other. That's a scary thought. If that's been going on for a few thousand years, which is nothing in galactic timelines, you might start to see the types of creatures that best survive when those replicators can also produce nuclear weapons or automated killing drones as easily as they can food or power plant. You might see that the most survivable types are the ones who stay apart, that they do not cluster in large groups. Either they stick to the individual or they stick to a very small group. And those might be the same folks who say, well, what's best for me is to dig down to some comet-like body in the middle of nowhere and stay there and run on low power for 10 trillion years, or to grab that body and throw myself out of the galaxy with it out past Hubble expansion where no one's ever going to find me or have any economical reason to hunt for me. And then I can live by myself where no one want to kill me except myself. And I have my brain wired to make it impossible for me when I commit suicide. That's in the zone of what you could do with technology. It's not really all that advanced. You will never get bored because you have a wire in your head that prevents it. You can slide that dial. You will never have self-destructive thoughts because you've had that prevented. And you have an AI who is utterly loyal to you and will provide you everything you need. You have all of humankind's history and wisdom and literature written down on a device that small, and you have 1,000 copies of it. And what else do you need people for? They, at this point in time, from an evolutionary standpoint, are now a threat to you because only another intelligence can really threaten you. And in a case like that, and I call that one the Hermit Shoplifter hypothesis because I shouldn't name things, but I keep having to, is one of those scenarios where you might find that you just didn't get that big Dyson level growth because they were around. They weren't really hostile, but they didn't want to talk to you much. And when they did interact, it was basically just to come by and steal a little bit of resources or your data banks. And they got their copy and they'll leave it. They don't want to talk to you because it's dangerous. They might like you and then to do something suicidal like stick around to talk to you, which amounts to that on billion-year timelines.
Well, Isaac, I want to thank you for an absolutely fabulous conversation. This weekend, I'm going to be celebrating Jason's 40th birthday with him, and we're going to be playing the board game Cosmic Encounters, which includes a whole range of strange alien races trying to annihilate each other. So we'll get to think about all the wonderful speculative work we've done tomorrow as well. It was wonderful having you on the show.